Welcome to the Doyenne of Death podcast, funeral planning for those who don't plan to die. It's all about end-of-life issues and getting the conversation started about our 100% mortality rate. This series is hosted by Gail Rubin, certified thanatologist and the Doyenne of Death. A doyenne is a woman who's considered senior in a group and knows a lot about a particular subject. So here to talk about the subjects we sometimes avoid is author, speaker, and the Doyenne of Death, Gail Rubin.
Welcome. This is part 2 of our 2-part episode. If you missed part 1, do yourself a favor and go back to listen. And now back to more with the Doyenne of Death. One of the developments that you write about is the creation of burial vaults. And we get that because we had the rise of medical schools, which prompted the rise of body snatching from graveyards, and vaults were a way to try and prevent that. What would surprise our listeners about the development of burial vaults?
Probably everything. This seems to be everyone's favorite chapter. And you know, Gail, when I'm with a family and we have to go into the selection room, and you know, most people are familiar with the casket. People hear funeral, they associate casket with that in their mind. But then we turn to the burial vaults, or what the FTC makes us call the outer burial container. Then people go, well, what's that for? And it's morphed into something that is, kind of warranted to be weatherproof. So the people that buy, the actual burial vaults are buying ones that are warranted to seal against the elements. But if they don't buy one with a plastic liner, essentially one that seals, I explained to them that, think about everything that's driving over the cemetery grounds these days. You've got backhoes, you've got these huge lawnmowers, you've got stake body trucks that are going to be installing monuments or carrying earth. And you've got the buggies that carry the burial vaults themselves for, an installation on the grave next to you. So you've got a lot of heavy equipment driving over the cemetery grounds. And what these things do now is they maintain the integrity of the cemetery ground, keep the graves from collapsing, and keep the monuments from toppling over, people from twisting their ankles. If you go into an old Civil War cemetery, you're going to see the ground is going like this. It's waffling. And that's because a lot of times the graves have collapsed. And, more often than not, you'll see some headstones that have toppled over. When you explain it to people like that, they go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. It keeps the cost of maintenance overall for the cemetery lower and keeps the cemetery looking nicer. But what most people don't realize is kind of the origin behind the burial vault. And they were originated to combat the scourge of body snatchers. And this is something that had been plaguing Americans for really as long as America has been colonized. Going back to William Shippen, one of the first doctors' riots over somebody being accosted because they were dissecting people was in Philadelphia in I want to say the early 17th century. I don't have the date right here in front of me. But somebody fired a pistol at his carriage because he, had a dissection theater. And throughout, the next century and a half, we see these riots boiling over from time to time. When a medical college has been suspected of pilfering what I'm going to call the worthy dead. So a lot of times, if these medical colleges were digging up the graves of, essentially the pauper's field, the potter's field, people either didn't know, or those folks whose family members it was affecting didn't have the voice to kind of protest against the medical people. It was only when there was reports of, churchyard cemeteries being emptied that things would start to get violent. And, throughout this century and a half, 2 centuries, we see these riots occurring sometimes where the military needed to get called in. And, in the case of the doctors' riot in New York City, it's thought that upwards of 20 people were killed in that riot, when the militia opened fire on the crowd to calm them down because they were throwing, bricks and things at the jail keepers and some of the local politicians. It's I think it's 4 confirmed dead, but they think, as many as 16 more were carried home and probably died as a result of their wounds, ironically, for lack of a doctor's care, right? So it kind of all came to a head in 1878 when John Scott Harrison, who was the son of William Henry Harrison and the father of Benjamin Harrison. Okay, so he was a president's son and a president's father. And there was just this spectacular body snatching. Grave robbers managed to get his body, and it was discovered in a medical school by his son. And I mean, kind of the twists and turns is something that, almost out of a movie, how it came to be about. And when the public heard about this, they were just screaming for blood. And believe it or not, it was the family. It was Benjamin Harrison who called for cooler heads and legal action against the doctors and the grave robbers that were involved in this scenario. But this is when we see kind of the first, I'm going to call them offensive things being created. The first one being the grave torpedo, which a man by the name of Philip Clover in Ohio patented right around that time. I don't know if it was 78 or 79. It was essentially a shotgun. And the directions were to secret this near the pillow of the decedent. And that way, if a grave robber smashed open the coffin, and they would always smash open the head end. They would never dig up the entire thing. They would dig a shaft straight down and smash open the head end, pull the remains out, and they'd be gone. And then shortly after that, there's a judge by the name of Thomas Howe who patented something that was similar to, it basically was a landmine that you were supposed to bury above the coffin. And, if a grave robber encountered it, it would explode. And one newspaper commented that this was probably more of a moral solution than a practical one. Because imagine, this huge shotgun-like thing going off in a coffin or a landmine exploding. It's definitely going to disturb the remains, but this was the mindset. The families were more concerned with their loved one not becoming scalpel fodder, is how they saw it. And then at the same time, we have what I call kind of the defensive products being created, and kind of the forefather of the American burial vault that we see today. And the first one was called a burial safe. It was invented by a man by the name of Van Bibber. It looked kind of like lattice work, iron lattice work. And you still see these above some graves in Scotland. They were put above the grave and held in place with a ledger stone. Well, the American version was a full cage that the coffin would be placed in and would be buried. And then the next year, we have George Boyd, who patented the burial vault. What would be now is exactly the same as the metal burial vault. And this thing was advertised that it would take a skilled plumber 24 hours to cut into it. So if a grave robber, or as they were called, resurrectionists, is digging down and they come across this, they're immediately going to give up and they're going to go after the low-hanging fruit. So the advertisements for George Boyd's metal burial vault in the late 19th century were, they say burglar proof. And that's what they were billed as. And then as we start to see Americans donating their bodies to science and kind of the whole mindset about scientific research change, resurrectionists, they went the way of the horse and buggy. And then, you see burial vaults, I don't want to say being rebranded because I don't think that's the right word, but cemeterians started to see the value in having the burial vault and how it, like I explained earlier, maintain the integrity of the cemetery grounds. And, cemeterians said, hey, we still want this product because it makes caring for cemeteries easier. Mm-hmm. And, that's how kind of the long explanation of how we got the burial vault today.
Well, and it's kind of ironic that a number of people choose to donate their bodies to science now so that they get the free cremation.
That's right. The mindset has certainly changed in the last 140 years. Definitely a 180. There's not that fear of, and it was kind of tied up with the fear of not being able to be resurrected. I mean, it was that, there was definitely this huge religious component to it. And thankfully, that's, like I said, gone the way of the horse and buggy.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of cremation, of course, that's been a huge development in the United States that we, and I think the first cremation in the U.S., you tell it beautifully, this guy in Pennsylvania, what is it, Washington, Pennsylvania, and he creates his own crematory and then other people want to come and use it.
Yeah. Dr. Lemoine in Washington, Pennsylvania. And, he created this crematorium. So he was interested in sanitary reform. So he was worried that cemeteries were polluting the drinking water. And he built this crematorium for his own eventual demise. So he did not build this as a commercial endeavor. He did approach a local cemetery and say, can I build this on your land? And they essentially laughed him, out of there and said, absolutely not. So he said, fine. He was well-to-do. He was a doctor and had a fair amount of land. So he said, he designed the crematorium and paid for it and built it on his land. And that was, going to be his for when he died. And, his whole thought process was, this is a way to prove that, cremation is a more sanitary alternative to inhumation. And while his crematorium was being built, a Bavarian nobleman by the name of Baron de Palm died, and he was tied in with this new religion called Theosophy, that Henry Steele Alcott had co-founded, and Colonel Alcott prevailed upon Lemoine, to use his crematory and I think prove its efficacy, prove it could work. Because Lemoine was not one to, like I said, this was not a commercial endeavor, but Alcott appealed to him, and I think Lemoine was curious to see if it in fact would actually work. There's probably a little bit of ego tied up in there. If he uses it for his demise, he's never going to have the pleasure of knowing that it did in fact work. Although he had conducted what were called mutiny experiments, he cremated a couple sheep to make sure it would work. And I think he reported he got a gallon of powder out of it. So the Baron de Palm, he died in, I want to say, May, and the crematorium was not...
What year is this? Like
1876.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's, cremation has been around for a lot longer than people think it has been. But so May 1876, and the crematorium's not finished. So Alcott has De Palm embalmed, okay? and he's held in a receiving vault somewhere in Brooklyn. And then finally in December, the crematorium is finished, and De Palm's remains are shipped out to Washington, Pennsylvania for the first cremation. And it was a success. It worked. There was physicians from across the United States and different countries there to witness this. They each got a vial of the Baron's cremains to take home with them. One of those vials is on display in the National Funeral History Museum in Houston, Texas. So if you have any interest in seeing that, there is a great cremation display there that was created by a good friend of mine named Jason Engler. He is Cana's historian, and Cana, for those listeners that aren't in the profession, is the Cremation Association of North America. And there is a replica of the crematory room in Little Washington in the museum. And Engler went, and the other people involved with creating this display went so far as to, have the table where the remains would be laid prior to the cremation milled, so it's an exact replica of the one that is or was in that crematorium. So it's a really, really cool exhibit if you get the chance and you're in Houston, have any interest. The whole museum is amazing.
Well, and it's amazing that cremation, when it first was getting going as more popular, I want to say like the 1920s, but even then it was just a fraction of the population using it. And boy, things sure have changed.
Exactly. I believe by the 1960s, cremation was still under 5%. It took a long, long time to get going here in America. And I don't know if your listeners have any interest, but kind of what I theorize, a couple of the reasons that cremation kind of took off in America. The first was Jessica Mitford's scathing expose of the funeral profession, the American way of death. And then the other is in the 60s, you kind of see the rise of these, cremation societies. And from there, you start to see the cremation rate in America rise, at a steady clip, almost kind of hit that, that upward slope. Whereas, from 1876 until 1960, cremation was almost unheard of.
And now here we are in 2022, and national average is above 50% now. I'm thinking it's closer to 60. I think
it's around 58.
Yeah.
I think it's going to hit 60 next year, maybe. I think it's around 58% this year, or projected to be. Mm-hmm. And I think it rises at 1.8% every year. So pretty steady rise. I've been doing this 18 years, and I want to say, where I am, the cremation rate was about 35% when I started. And, now, and the crazy thing, Gail, is, when I went to mortuary school, I didn't take any classes on cremation. I've had to educate myself about it after the fact. Thankfully, they are teaching, classes on cremation now in mortuary school, but it took a while for the educational component to kind of catch up with the times, which just kind of floors me. I mean, even when I went to mortuary school and cremation was 35-40% or whatever it was, that's still a pretty big chunk. And for cremation not to really be part of the conversation then. But
and so many of the mortuary schools were founded to sell the chemicals for embalming, and big emphasis on the embalming.
Well, yeah, a lot of them were called embalming schools that kind of morphed into a more generalized, kind of mortuary education, that covers, the soft sciences as well as the hard sciences, so accounting, mortuary law, psychology, all those are, what they call the soft sciences.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that brings us to the new trends that funeral directors need to be educated about. It's amazing what's going on in the field with more eco-friendly methods of disposition, with people wanting to talk about death. I mean, I think we can agree that it's hard to get people to discuss death, but there are new death discussion movements. In fact, you interviewed me about those for your book. And, there's so much to talk about.
That's right. Yeah. And thank you. Thank you for your contribution. Yes, I appreciate that. Well, Gail, it's when people talk about kind of the next thing in funeral service, a lot of times, the thing on their mind is final disposition. Okay. And final disposition is, right now, the big ones are burial and cremation. Well, when I started writing the book, back in 2018, nobody had heard of human composting, which is called NOR, natural organic reduction. And now it's legal in 4 states, and there's legislation in a bunch of other states. And alkaline hydrolysis is legal in 22 states. And for your listeners who aren't in the profession, alkaline hydrolysis is sometimes called, water cremation or aquamation. And it's essentially reducing the body to something that looks like flame cremated remains, but using water and an alkaline substance and some heat and pressure. But what you get back are, the layperson would not be able to tell the difference between that and flame cremated remains. So, there's these different forms of disposition that are emerging. And then, of course, there's the throwback green cremation, which is really a throwback to colonial burial practices. And that seems to be what the conversation is caught on, if you will. But I give you a lot of credit for, talking about all the other stuff that isn't disposition, talking about, getting your financial affairs in order, talking about putting your notes down for your obituary. What do you want said about you? Who else better knows that than you? The person that lived the life, your family and your friends, they're going to do the best they can. But there's no greater gift to leave your family at least a set of notes. It's like, hey, this is what I want to go in my obituary. And really, if you have the wherewithal, don't stop there. Go to your local funeral home, get some ideas down on paper. And people then go, well, prepaying and all that racket. And, I'm not going to say good, bad, or indifferent about prepaying. All I'm saying is pre-planning. You don't have to prepay for your funeral if you're not comfortable doing that. That's a whole nother conversation, but at least go in and get your wishes down on paper. So, I've never had a family, not one scale, after we've made the arrangements or finalized the arrangements, I should say, sit back in their chair and say, God, I wish mom or dad hadn't pre-planned. Never once. They're always so glad that their parents even picked out. And this might seem like kind of a trivial thing, but like even the little verse for the back of the prayer card, people will agonize over this, but if they know their mom wanted that, that brings them peace. And then there's kind of the other big things that are happening in funeral service. The rise of the unchurched, which I think COVID has made, I don't want to say even worse, but there are even more unchurched, when churches went virtual. Yeah, absolutely. There's a certain segment of the population that those churches will never get back. And so we're seeing more and more funeral celebrants, so more and more families want humanistic services. And, good, bad, or indifferent. Different people have opinions on that. But that's just the way things are going. You're going to see more of those. So I'm sitting down with a lot of families and kind of starting from scratch, creating a funeral service, because they're not religious. So they can't fall back on that religious rubric that dictates, maybe a Methodist funeral service or a Catholic funeral service or even a Muslim funeral service, right? We're starting from scratch and creating something that's meaningful to them. And then the last thing I want to touch on, that I kind of see coming way down the pike, but maybe not that far, is VR funerals. I definitely think there will be a time, probably before I retire, that Gail, you'll be sitting on your couch with a set of VR goggles, and I'll be sitting on my couch with a set of VR goggles, and we'll go to, maybe some beach somewhere and pay our respects to Mrs. Smith for the loss of her husband without ever having gotten up off our couch.
Wow.
And I definitely think that is going to be, a piece of funeral service in the not so distant future.
Incredible. Well, Todd, this has been an amazing conversation. The book is LAST RITES, The Evolution of the American Funeral. An incredible book, amazing history, very colorful. You did a great job on this book, Todd.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It was a labor of love, a very, very, very long labor of love.
And you can find this book, it's on Amazon and bookstores, wherever you buy books, or ebooks. I'm guessing there's ebooks as well. Yeah.
Or if you want somebody to talk it to you, T. Ryder Smith did a great job narrating it. So you can download the audiobook and have somebody tell it to you.
Oh, wonderful. And your website is Todd Harra, TODDHARRA.com, where we can also learn about your other books, your novels, which I didn't know about until just before we had this conversation. The Trip Clipper Undertaker Mystery Series and Grave Matters and Patient Zero. Sounds so fascinating.
Thank you for joining us on the Doyenne of Death podcast. You can find episodes of this podcast and past episodes of A Good Goodbye with Gail Rubin on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. For more information on Gail's work, visit agoodgoodbye.com.